It began like any other taping day until everything stopped. The studio lights hummed softly above the Family Feud stage, casting their familiar golden glow on the smiling faces of two families ready to play. The music faded, laughter filled the room, and Steve Harvey, sharp in his tailored dark suit, that warm, knowing smile beneath his mustache, strode to the center with the kind of energy only years of laughter can teach. But beneath the rhythm of jokes and applause, something unseen was already building. A moment no script could write, no camera could prepare for. He leaned over the podium, reading the next question with that signature grin. We asked, 100 people, name something you might keep to remember someone you love. Buzzers clicked. Photos, someone shouted. Letters. Jewelry. Jewelry. The board lit up, the crowd clapping, the energy alive. But then came the smallest contestant of the day, a little girl named Maya, no more than 8 years old, with curls that framed her face and eyes that seemed far older than her years. She stood barely taller than the podium, her hands gripping its edge like she was holding on to the world. Steve knelt slightly, microphone in hand, smiling. Hey, sweetheart, what's your name? Maya, she said shyly, her voice small but steady. Maya, Steve repeated gently, his tone softening. You nervous, baby? She nodded. The audience chuckled kindly. That's all right, he said. You just have fun with me, okay? You ready? She nodded again, a hint of a smile appearing. He looked down at his card. All right, Maya. Name something you might keep to remember someone you love. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the ceiling lights, as though the answer was floating up there somewhere. Then she looked straight ahead and said quietly, A picture. The audience clapped, and Steve grinned. Good answer. He turned to the board. Show me. Picture. The buzzer sounded. Number 1 answer, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Maya jumped, clapping her little hands, her mother standing behind her cheering proudly. Steve laughed, shaking his head. Well, look at that. She knew it all along. But something shifted when he looked at the mother. Her smile was warm, but her eyes, they carried a weight. A kind of strength that comes from holding too much pain for too long. Steve noticed it, he always did. He had a way of seeing past what people said, into what they carried. The game went on, light and fun. Families teased each other. Laughter filled the air. But as the final round approached, Steve's producer's voice came softly through his earpiece. Steve, stand by. We have a surprise video package for the family after this round. Steve smiled, not thinking much of it. They often did little tributes, birthdays, family milestones, even veterans' surprises. It was part of what made the show special. The round ended. The audience applauded, and then the lights dimmed slightly. Steve turned toward the family, his tone gentler now. All right, before we wrap today's show, he said, we got a little something for y'all. I hear there's someone in this family we all should know about. The mother's eyes widened slightly. She reached out instinctively, resting her hands on Maya's shoulders. Steve nodded toward the big screen above the stage. Let's take a look. The screen flickered to life. The room dimmed further, and the first image appeared, a photograph of a man in a soldier's uniform, standing tall, smiling beneath a desert sun. The audience clapped softly, sensing the tone shift. Steve turned toward the mother. Ma'am, he said quietly, this your husband? She nodded, her lips trembling. Yes, sir. Steve's voice softened. He serve overseas? He serve overseas? Yes, she whispered. He didn't make it back. The room fell still. Even the hum of the lights seemed to hush. Steve placed a hand over his heart. We thank him for his service, he said quietly. And we thank you for your strength. The mother nodded, tears glistening. But before anyone could speak again, the screen shifted from the photo to a short video clip. At first, it was just static. Then, the face of the same man appeared, laughing, holding a baby. His voice filled the room, deep and kind. Hey, baby girl, Daddy loves you. Don't forget me, okay? I'll always be right here. Maya's hands flew to her mouth. Her tiny body trembled. "That's him," she whispered. "That's my daddy." Steve froze. The audience gasped. The video played on, the man's smile filling the screen, the sound of his laugh echoing across the stage. The little girl stepped forward, drawn to the image like light to memory. "Mommy, look." Her mother covered her face, sobbing quietly. Steve turned toward the screen, his eyes glistening, his cue cards forgotten. Maya reached out, her hand small, trembling as though she could touch the image. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered. And that was the moment Steve Harvey couldn't do it anymore. He turned away from the crowd, pressing a hand to his face. The cameras caught him walking off the stage, down the small steps at the side, his shoulders shaking slightly. The audience didn't clap. They didn't move. All they could do was watch as a little girl reached for her father's face on a glowing screen, whispering the word "Daddy" into the kind of silence that only love can make sacred. The silence stretched long after the video faded. The screen went dark, but its glow seemed to linger etched into the faces of everyone in the studio. No one dared to speak. The only sound was the soft hum of the cameras and the quiet, uneven breathing of a child trying to understand what her heart already knew. Steve Harvey stood just off stage, his back to the audience. His hand covered his mouth, his eyes glistening as he stared at the floor. A man who had spent decades making people laugh now stood still, unguarded, completely undone by the purity of a child's love. One of the crew members whispered, "Do we cut?" But no one moved. Even television had the good sense to stop. On stage, Maya was still standing in front of the big screen, her small hand frozen in the air as if she could still touch her father's face through the darkness. Her mother knelt beside her, arms trembling, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. She whispered something into Maya's ear, something that only a mother could say in a moment like that, something to hold her little girl together when words could never be enough. Then the lights dimmed even softer. Steve slowly turned back toward the stage, wiping his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. When he walked back into the light, he didn't carry the showman's grin anymore. He walked slowly, shoulders heavy but heart open, the kind of posture you see in a man who's carrying something sacred. He stepped up beside Maya and knelt beside her so their eyes were level. "Sweetheart," he said gently, voice trembling. "That was your daddy, wasn't it?" Maya nodded, her curls bouncing as she fought back tears. "Yes, sir." Steve smiled softly. "He's a good-looking man," he said. "You look just like him." That made her smile just a little, just enough to let the light back in. Her mother reached out, her hand resting on Maya's back. "She used to watch that video every night before bed," she said, her voice quiet, fragile. "I didn't know they were going to play it today." Steve looked up toward the booth, his expression understanding. "Sometimes," he said softly, "things happen exactly when they're supposed to." He turned back to Maya. "What was your daddy's name, baby?" "Marcus," she whispered. "Marcus," Steve repeated, letting the name linger in the air like a prayer. "He sounds like the kind of man who'd fill a whole room when he walked in." Maya smiled again. "He made everybody laugh," she said. "He used to call me his little hero." Steve's eyes softened. "Then I think he'd be mighty proud of his little hero right now." The audience murmured quietly, their tears no longer hidden. Steve took a slow breath, then motioned toward the screen. "You know what I think, Maya?" he said gently. "I think your daddy's right here with you. You know how I know that?" She shook her head. "Because every time you talk about him," Steve said, "I can see him right there, shining in your smile." Maya's lips quivered. She took a step closer to Steve, her small hand reaching for his. Without hesitation, he took at his large, warm hand closing gently around hers. It wasn't television anymore. It was human. It was church. The lights around them softened even more, the room glowing like sunset. Steve turned slightly toward the audience, still holding Maya's hand. "Sometimes," he said, "a little child will walk into a place and remind us all what love really looks like. This little girl right here, she didn't just see her father on that screen. She reminded us what it means to remember." The audience stood slowly, one by one, not clapping but simply standing in shared reverence. Some wiped their faces, others just bowed their heads. Steve glanced back at Maya and smiled again, the tears in his eyes no longer hidden. You're strong, baby. You know that?" She nodded, a faint smile trembling on her lips. "You're gonna grow up and make him proud every single day," Steve said. "And when you do, I want you to remember something. Every laugh you share, every kind thing you do, that's your daddy living through you." Her mother choked back a sob. Steve looked up at her, his voice lowering even further. "Ma'am, I can't imagine how hard it's been. But I need you to know you're raising one remarkable little girl. You've given her a heart that still believes." The woman nodded through tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He'd be grateful for this moment. Steve smiled faintly. "Then I think he's grateful right now." The audience was silent, transfixed. Somewhere in the rafters, a soft hum of feedback whispered through the speakers, a low, gentle vibration, almost like a sigh. Steve looked upward, his eyes narrowing slightly, and then he smiled. "You hear that?" he said softly. "That's him. I believe that's him saying, 'I'm here.'" Maya turned her face toward the ceiling, eyes wide. "Hi, Daddy," she said quietly. The studio filled with quiet tears. The moment was no longer confined to the walls. It felt like it expanded, spilling beyond the cameras and lights, out into the world that would one day watch this moment on screen and feel its heartbeat. Steve squeezed Maya's hand again, standing slowly. "You gave the world something today, sweetheart," he said softly. "You showed us that love doesn't end, it just finds new ways to speak." He turned toward the audience. "Sometimes we think these shows are just for laughter, but every now and then, God sneaks in something like this to remind us that we're all connected by the same thing, love that never leaves." The camera zoomed in on Maya's face, small, bright, tear-streaked, and brave. Her eyes shone beneath the studio light, as if reflecting something unseen. And in that stillness, for the first time all day, the audience clapped not wildly, not as spectators, but as witnesses. It was soft, rhythmic, full of heart. Steve turned back toward the screen one last time, where the image of Marcus, the soldier, the father, the husband, had reappeared, smiling as if caught between two worlds. The host bowed his head slightly and whispered, "Thank you for showing up today." The crowd quieted again, the lights flickering to a golden glow. Maya looked up at Steve. "Can I hug you?" she asked. He bent down, opening his arms. "Come here, baby." She ran into his embrace, her little arms wrapping around him tight. The audience rose again, their tears now unashamed. And under the hum of the lights, in that moment of human stillness, Steve Harvey closed his eyes, holding the little girl like he was holding the whole world together for her. Sound of applause had faded to something softer. The sound of breathing, of hearts remembering how to beat after breaking. The little girl stayed wrapped in Steve Harvey's arms, her cheek pressed against his chest, her small frame trembling from the weight of too many emotions for such a young heart. Steve didn't let go. He just stood there, eyes closed, one hand resting gently on the back of her head, a gesture that felt less like comfort and more like prayer. The camera zoomed in on the image, the man who spent his life making the world laugh, holding a child who had just met her father again, not through touch, but through memory. The studio lights glowed like sunlight filtering through church windows, golden and reverent. When Steve finally spoke, his voice was hushed, thick with emotion. "You know," he said softly, "I always ask God to let me be a blessing to somebody. But today, I think this little girl here blessed all of us." The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of soft amens and sniffles. Maya looked up at him, her eyes still wet but glowing now, calmer. "I think Daddy's happy," she said. Steve smiled through tears. "Oh, baby," he whispered. "I think he's smiling bigger than anybody in this room." Her mother nodded from a few feet away, her hand pressed against her heart, whispering something only she and heaven could hear. Steve crouched down so that he and Maya were eye to eye again. "You know, sweetheart," he said, "there's a lot of people out there who lose somebody they love, and they think that's the end. But what you showed us today, what your daddy just reminded us, is that love don't have an ending. It just changes how it shows up." Maya tilted her head, thinking, "Like a different kind of forever?" "Ah," Steve blinked back a tear, smiling. "Exactly that, baby. A different kind of forever. The audience exhaled as one. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of the kind of truth that doesn't need words. One of the cameramen wiped his face quietly behind the lens. Even the crew members, professionals who had seen hundreds of shows, couldn't hide what they felt. The energy in the room had changed. It no longer belonged to entertainment. It belonged to healing. Then Steve stood and looked out over the audience, his voice finding strength again, though it still quivered around the edges. "You know, people watch this show for laughs," he said, pacing slowly across the stage. "But every now and then, God slips something through these lights that ain't about laughter at all. It's about remembering what matters." He turned back toward Maya and her mother. "Your husband gave this world something today. He reminded every one of us that the love we give, the way we show up for our family, it doesn't disappear. It leaves something behind that lives on." He gestured toward Maya. "It lives on in this little girl." The audience applauded again, quiet but steady. Steve motioned toward the big screen, where Marcus's smiling face still lingered. "You know what I think?" he said softly. "I think that man didn't just serve his country, he served love. He gave this little girl something no one can ever take from her." Maya's mother covered her mouth as tears streamed freely. Steve continued, his deep voice trembling but clear. "You see, when you've been around as long as I have, you start realizing that life is made up of these moments. The kind that sneak up on you. The kind you don't expect. The kind that make you stop and remember why you're still here." He paused, turning slightly toward the audience. "You could feel it in here just now, that stillness. That's what truth feels like. It don't make noise. It don't need to. It just fills the space and reminds you that you're alive." Maya reached for his hand again, tugging gently. "Mr. Steve," she said softly, "can I tell you something?" He smiled, kneeling beside her once more. "Of course you can." She took a breath, the kind that sounds too heavy for a child. "When Daddy went to heaven," Mommy said, "God needed him for something important. I used to be mad at God, but now, I think maybe God sent him back today so I could see him again." Steve swallowed hard, pressing his lips together as his eyes filled. He nodded slowly. "You're right, baby. He came back because you needed to hear him say he's still here. And he did. You heard him, didn't you?" Maya nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "I did." Steve looked toward the ceiling lights, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "And that, y'all, is what love looks like when it refuses to die." The crowd erupted into gentle applause, not breaking the stillness, but amplifying it. Steve placed his hand over his heart, bowing his head slightly. "You know," he said softly, "there are some shows where you make people laugh, and then there are shows where you make people feel. This one, right here, I'll never forget." He turned to Maya's mother. "You raised a brave little girl, ma'am. And I can promise you something, your husband's legacy, it didn't just stay in your house. It touched every person in this room." The mother nodded through tears, whispering, "Thank you." Steve smiled gently. "No, thank you for sharing him with us." The lights warmed again, wrapping the stage in soft amber. The band, sensing the sacred stillness, played a slow instrumental, a tender melody that drifted through the room like a benediction. Maya clutched the small pendant around her neck, a silver locket shaped like a heart, and whispered something under her breath. When Steve asked softly, "What's that, baby?" she looked up and said, "He's in here." Steve's face softened. "Then you keep him right there, okay? That's your superpower." She smiled. "Mommy says love makes you strong." He nodded. "Your mommy's right." He looked out again at the audience, his voice quieter now, but certain. "What just happened here, that wasn't television. That was a reminder that even when you lose somebody, love always finds a way back home." The audience stood again, slow and unified, the sound of their applause blending with the gentle music. Steve rested his hand over his heart once more, then whispered toward the heavens, "We heard you, Marcus," loud and clear. And for the briefest second, the lights above seemed to flicker, not harshly, but softly, like a nod from somewhere unseen. The room gasped. Steve smiled through his tears. He said, "Thank you," he whispered. I just know he did. The audience, the crew, the families, everyone was crying now, but no one turned away. It was too beautiful to look from. Steve took Maya's hand once more and said gently, "You ready to finish this show, little one?" She nodded. "Can Daddy watch?" Steve smiled. "Oh, sweetheart," he never stopped. The lights in the studio softened to a warm amber glow, like dusk settling gently over a quiet street. The audience still hadn't sat down. No one wanted to. You could feel it in the air, the kind of sacred stillness that people don't find in everyday life anymore. A room that was built for laughter and applause had, for a few precious minutes, become something closer to a sanctuary. Steve Harvey stood there holding Maya's hand, the little girl who had turned an entire television set into a cathedral of love. Her mother stood beside them, wiping her tears with a trembling hand. The faint melody from the band filled the background, each note tender and deliberate, as if even the music didn't want to intrude too loudly. Steve took a deep breath, his eyes sweeping the audience, his voice finding that low, steady register that always seemed to come straight from the heart. "You know," he said, "this little girl just reminded us of something I think the whole world needs to hear, that love doesn't stop just because somebody leaves the room." The audience murmured, a wave of quiet agreement rolling through the crowd. Some nodded, others reached for the hands of the people beside them. Steve continued, still holding Maya's tiny fingers in his own. "This child, she came in here today thinking she was just playing a game, but what she did was show us all that God can walk right into the middle of a television show and stop time if he wants to. Because sometimes, a message of love is more important than any joke, any question, any applause." The mother looked up at him through her tears. "Thank you, Mr. Harvey," she whispered, "for letting him live here again. Even for a moment." Steve shook his head gently. "Ma'am," he said softly, "he never left. You kept him alive in her, and now the whole world knows his name." He turned toward Maya. "Baby, do you know what your daddy did today?" She tilted her head, curious. "What?" Steve smiled. That soft, fatherly kind of smile. He reminded every grown-up in this room what love really sounds like. And he reminded me too. Maya's smile grew, shy but real. "He was funny," she said, giggling through her tears. "He used to make up silly songs about me when I brushed my teeth." Steve laughed gently, shaking his head. "Now I know where you get that sparkle from. You carry him with you every time you smile." The audience smiled too, through their tears, through the ache. Steve straightened slowly, turning to the audience. His voice filled the space strong now, rich with that mix of humor, reverence, and gratitude that always seemed to live in his tone. "You know, people ask me all the time why I do what I do, why I still walk out here after all these years. It's moments like this." He paused, looking upward toward the lights. "See, when something like this happens, it reminds you that life ain't about fame or money. It's about moments that outlive us. It's about the people who leave a sound in our hearts, one that never fades." He looked back at Maya. "You'll hear his voice forever, sweetheart. Every time you're brave, every time you laugh, that's him. That's your daddy talking through you." Maya's eyes shone beneath the soft glow of the studio light. "I think I heard him just now," she said. When the lights flickered, Steve smiled, eyes glistening. "You and me both, baby. You and me both." He looked to the audience. "You all saw that, didn't you? Those lights flickered the moment I said his name. That's what I'm talking about. Love don't die, it just finds new ways to get your attention." The audience nodded, some wiping their eyes, others whispering prayers under their breath. The mother took a slow step forward. "Marcus used to say something before he deployed," she said softly, her voice cracking. "He'd say, 'If you ever need me, look for the light.' I think that was him just now, reminding us he's still looking out for her." Steve's breath caught in his throat. "Whew, that'll preach," he said quietly, shaking his head in awe. He looked back at Maya. "Baby girl, your daddy's light just filled this whole room, and now it's gonna keep shining through you." She smiled, clutching her heart. "Then I'll shine for him." Steve's voice lowered to a whisper. "That's exactly what you're supposed to do." He turned to the crowd, gesturing gently toward Maya and her mother. "Look at this family, y'all. Look what they gave us today. They came here for laughter and left us all with something holy. That's not just television, that's life showing up when you least expect it. The crowd stood again, one final time, their applause rolling softly through the studio. Some cried, some prayed, some just stood there, silent, because there are moments when words simply don't belong. Steve stepped back, his hand still resting on Maya's shoulder, and let the applause fade. Then he leaned into the microphone one last time. "You know," he said, voice trembling just slightly, "sometimes television doesn't just entertain, it heals. And today, it healed all of us." The lights warmed again, golden and gentle. Maya looked up at Steve, her hand still wrapped around his. "Mr. Harvey?" "Yes, baby?" She smiled, her voice soft but sure. "Thank you for helping Daddy talk." Steve's eyes filled once more. "No, sweetheart," he whispered. "You did that all by yourself." The studio fell quiet again, not empty, but full of the kind of stillness that means something sacred has happened here. And when the credits began to roll, Steve stood still at center stage, his arm around Maya and her mother, eyes lifted toward the light, as if he was thanking someone he couldn't see, but could still feel. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost.